So this summer at Zion, we're walking through and working through a book of the Bible. We're walking through and working through the first book of the Bible, which is the book of Genesis. And just in case you're new here or you're coming back for the first time in a long time, let me kind of catch you up as to what this series is all about. One of the fascinating features of the book of Genesis is that whether or not you grew up in church or you would consider yourself to be a biblical scholar, the book of Genesis is full of some very famous stories because these are stories that just kind of culturally we tell. So, for example, there's the one about Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit. You may have heard that before. That's in the book of Genesis. Or there's the one about this big tower that people build. It's called Babel. That's in the book of Genesis. But what we're discovering in this series is that if you just look at the book of Genesis as a collection of stories that we tell, you're actually kind of missing the main point of the book of Genesis, because the book of Genesis is a book of stories that we tell, and by the way, it's actually a book of true stories that we tell. Christians believe it's a historically credible and a historically reliable book. But at the heart of the book of Genesis is not just a collection of stories that we tell. At the heart of the book of Genesis is a collection of stories that are meant to tell us. They're meant to tell us things about faith and about life and about hope and about God. At the heart of this collection of stories that we tell are stories that are meant to tell us about the things in life that matter the most. And so kind of the big overarching question that we're asking in this series is this: what can this book of stories that we tell us about us and about God? Now, today as we continue our series, we come to the story that actually is a little lesser known than some of the other stories that we've been looking at so far in this series. It's the story of a guy named Jacob and his two wives, which means this already isn't going to go well, right? Okay, we got Rachel and we got Leah. You just know right up front, that's a bad idea. And we're going to find out why as we walk through and work through this story. Now, before we get to the story, let me kind of give you the backstory to this story, because we got to catch you up so you know where we've been, so you know where we're at. We first meet Jacob in Genesis chapter 25, and Jacob is born just a couple of minutes after his slightly older twin brother, Esau. And from the youngest of ages, we find out these two boys don't really get along. There's kind of a sibling rivalry going on here. In fact, we see it in that same chapter in Genesis 25, because the boys get a little bit older, and Esau kind of turns into an outdoorsy guy, and so he's out hunting one day, all day long, and he comes home at the end of the day, and he sees his little brother by a couple of minutes, Jacob, eating a bowl of dinty moor, okay? He's there in the tent, having a little stew, and Esau's really hungry, and so he says to his brother, "Hey, bro, give me a bowl of stew." Now, Esau kind of feels like he's starving to death because he's been out hunting all day long. And so he sees this bowl of stew as a desperate and dire need. But what Esau sees as a need, Jacob sees as an opportunity. Because he says to his brother, so you'd like a bowl of stew? Well, that's going to cost you. Now, just on background, one of the privileges that Esau had as kind of the older brother in the family, in fact, as the oldest brother in the family, was that he was going to be kind of the executor of the estate once his father passed away, and he was going to receive the lion's share of the inheritance once his father passed away. The best way to kind of think about this in our day and age would be something like this. He was the prince who would one day become the king. He was going to be large and in charge of his family once his father passed away. And so Jacob knows this, and he's always been a little upset by this because, after all, he's only a couple minutes younger than his older brother. And so he says to his brother, "All right, I'll give you a bowl of stew, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to sell me your executorship and your share of the inheritance." Now, Esau's not the brightest bulb, and so he makes the deal. Is that a good deal or a bad deal, by the way? It's a bad deal. But he makes it. He gets the bowl of stew. Now, one of the reasons I kind of think that maybe Esau made this deal for this bowl of stew is because he never really thought that it was actually going to go through. Because, he thought, certainly my dad is never going to actually let this happen. But then Jacob gets the best of his older brother again, just a couple of chapters later, this time in Genesis 27, when his dad, he's losing his eyesight. He can't really see anything. He's always in the dark. And so Jacob actually dresses up like his older brother Esau, and he goes in to his father. And he actually tricks his father into signing over the executorship and the inheritance all to him, like legally. So he really is going to get it all. And when Esau finds out about this, kind of understandably, he's really upset about this. In fact, he's so upset about this that he threatens to kill his little brother Jacob. And so here's what Jacob has to do. Jacob has to run away, and it's all this background that takes us to our story for today in Genesis 29. Because in Genesis 29, Jacob is on the lam, he's running away, and in Genesis 29, he thinks he's finally found himself a place to stay. Here's the story. Genesis 29, beginning at verse 1. Jacob continued on his journey, running away from his brother. And in verse 2, he gets to an open country where he sees a well. And there are 3 flocks of sheep lying near the well because the flocks were watered from the well. Now, there was a stone over the mouth of the well that was very large. Here's how large it is. When all the flocks of sheep were gathered there, all the shepherds, they would all have to get together, and they would have to do the old heave-ho of the stone to roll it away from the well's mouth so they could water the sheep. And so here's Jacob. He's been running away from his brother for quite a while now. And Jacob comes into the middle of an open country where he just happens to stumble across a well. And for Jacob, this well kind of had to feel like a godsend, and here's why. In the ancient world, there weren't interstates with truck stops and soda fountains and snacks. The only roads in the ancient world were back roads. And Jacob wasn't in a truck, he was on foot, and he didn't know where his next meal or his next drink was going to come from. And so it was very possible that if he didn't find something to drink or eat soon, he was going to starve to death and dehydrate to death. But then in Genesis 29, wouldn't you know it, he comes across this well. But as soon as he finds this well, he also discovers a problem with this well. On top of this well is this very large stone. It's so large, in fact, that it takes a whole gaggle of shepherds to roll the stone away from the well. Now, the stone was there probably for a couple of reasons. Number one, so no animals would fall into the well, because you'd water sheep from the well, and sheep aren't very smart, so you wanted to keep them away from the well. But here's the other reason they had this large stone over the well, probably to keep people from pilfering the water in the well. And so Jacob gets to the well, but he can't drink from the well. Now, while he's thinking about this, all of a sudden, in Genesis 29, verse 9, there's this girl that starts coming into the open country, into the pasture. Her name is Rachel. And she's coming with her father's sheep, and look at this. She's a country girl, the best kind of girl. She's a shepherd. Now, Jacob has seen this girl before, apparently, because he knows that she is the daughter of a relative of his uncle Laban. And Rachel is actually shepherding Laban's sheep. And so Jacob goes over, and look at what he does. This is amazing. He single-handedly rolls the stone away from the mouth of the well so that he can water his uncle's sheep. Now, it's here where this story kind of takes an interesting turn, because all of a sudden, Jacob goes from being a guy on the run to showing off his muscles in the sun, right? Because he does what it would normally take a whole group and gaggle of shepherds to do. He just goes over there and he just rolls that stone away. And all of the shepherds who are watching this are shocked. Rachel, she's impressed. She kind of swoons over this young man. And so what does she do? Well, she runs home to find her dad, to find his uncle Laban, and Jacob gets to meet the whole family. Genesis 29, verse 16, he meets Laban and his 2 daughters. Laban has 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger, the one that Jacob kind of likes, has a crush on, her name is Rachel. And then we get this very interesting line here in verse 16. It says that Leah had weak eyes. Now, this is actually an ancient Hebrew idiom that basically means this: Leah wasn't much to look at. In other words, if there was a beauty pageant, she would not only not win it, she probably wouldn't even be able to enter it. In fact, let me take this a step farther. I got myself in trouble after the early service because someone told me, I actually know someone who's named Leah. So if you're named Leah, this is just ancient Hebrew, okay? Old Testament is written in ancient Hebrew, and the word Leah is actually related to the Hebrew word for cow. I wish I was making that up, but I'm not. And so from her very youngest of years, Leah she wasn't much of a looker. Now, you contrast that with her younger sister Rachel, verse 17. Rachel had a lovely figure, and she was beautiful. And Jacob was in love with Rachel. And he said to his uncle Laban, I want to marry your daughter, so I'm going to work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. Now, you need to understand this on background. The deal that Jacob is trying to cut with Laban is absolutely astronomical. There were bride prices in the ancient world, or dowries, where you would actually pay the father of the bride to marry his daughter, which is what Jacob's offering to do to Laban to marry Rachel here. Now, the average bride price in the ancient world was somewhere around the neighborhood of 50 shekels. And if you were a day laborer in the ancient world, you would make somewhere around the neighborhood of like 2 shekels a month. So you can do the math, and under normal circumstances, it would take Jacob, a little better than 2 years to pay off his debt to marry this girl. But Jacob, right out of the gate, he offers to work for his uncle Laban for over triple that. He offers to work for his uncle Laban for 7 years. Because that's how much he loves this girl. That's how enamored he is by this girl. He will do anything for this girl. And so Laban knows he has a good deal, so he says, deal. And the two of them enter into this contract. And Jacob does 7 years of work. Well, the 7 years come and the 7 years go. And finally now, it's time for Jacob. Finally, it's time for Jacob to get the girl. This is the day he's been waiting for. Genesis 29, verse 21, Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her. Now, I need to pause right there, too, and just give you a little advice. If you're a young man, okay, and you can pass this along to any young men you know, and you go to the father of a girl you want to marry, do not say to her, I want to marry your daughter so I can make love to your daughter. Don't do that, especially if the father has firearms. Everybody got it? It's a bad idea. That's what Jacob does. By the way, it was a bad idea even back then. Laban doesn't have any guns, thankfully, but Laban does kind of get the best of Jacob here. Because here's what Laban does. Laban, on the outside, he kind of obliges. He's really happy. In fact, here's what he does, verse 22. He brings together all the people of the place, and he gives a big feast. It's like a wedding feast, a big old party. They're going to be married. But then, verse 23, when evening came, look at what Laban does. He swaps out the brides. He takes his daughter Leah and brings her to Jacob. And Jacob made love to her. And when morning came, look at that. He wakes up and there's not Rachel, but Leah. Now, be honest about something, okay? If you've read this story before, if you've heard this story before, have you ever wondered to yourself, how in the world did Jacob not know it wasn't Rachel? Anybody ever wonder that? I mean, this is like a bad episode of Jerry Springer. It's that tawdry, right? I woke up with a woman who wasn't my wife. You could put that on a bad talk show. So what's going on here? How did Jacob get duped like this? Well, 2 quick things I want to point out to you. First thing, in verse 22, Laban throws this feast, this wedding feast for him and his new bride, or what Jacob thinks is going to be his new bride. And the Old Testament written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew word behind this word for feast is the word meshteh, which actually is kind of a technical term that refers to not just any old party, but a party that involves alcohol. And so Laban very carefully throws a kegger, which means that Jacob is drinking here, and he's probably drinking a little bit too much. And so they have this big party, and then notice when he swaps out the brides, verse 23 of Genesis 29, he does it when evening came. That's when he takes his daughter Leah. That's when he brings her to Jacob, and that's when Jacob makes love to her. Now, in the ancient world, let me do a little scientific, like technological pop quiz for you. Did they have street lights and lamp lights and any lights at all? Yes or no? The answer is no. Which means that when it got dark, it was just dark. All you had was like a little starlight, maybe some moonlight. Not only that, it was the custom in the ancient world for the bride to actually wear her veil on her wedding night. And so Leah was covered up. Here's what Laban essentially does. He dresses up Leah to look like Rachel to fool Jacob on his wedding night. After he's had too much to drink, when he can't see because it's really dark, and he wakes up and he doesn't know what happened, but all he knows is that he's waking up next to the wrong woman. Now, understandably, Jacob's not happy. Genesis 29, verse 25, Jacob goes to Laban and says to Laban, what is this that you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Now Laban kind of needs to make up an answer here because he knows what he's done is wrong. And so he kind of stutters and stammers, and then he goes, I got a reason. It's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to finish this daughter's bridal week, then we'll give you the younger one also. But, Laban says, it's going to cost you. You're going to have to work for me for another 7 years. It's so interesting. Jacob is willing to sell to his older brother a bowl of stew, but it's going to cost him. He's going to have to sell to his younger brother his executorship and his inheritance. Jacob can get the girl of his dreams, but it's going to cost him. He's going to have to give to his uncle Laban not just 7 years of his life, but 14 years of his life. You know, Jacob finally gets that executorship and that inheritance by fooling his dad, by dressing up like his brother and going to his dad who's blind, so everything's dark, and that's how he pulls it off. Laban winds up fooling Jacob by waiting till evening comes, so everything's dark, and then he dresses up his older daughter like his younger daughter. Jacob can't even see and doesn't even notice, and that's how Laban pulls it off. It turns out that everything that Jacob did to his family is now doing to him. And the deceits and the cons and the rip-offs cause nothing but disaster. Jacob now has 2 wives, and immediately we see the problem. Genesis 29, verse 30, here's the problem. Jacob's love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And of course it was, because that was the girl that when he first saw her, he fell head over heels for her. Now Rachel has her own problems. In verse 31, it says that Rachel can't have children. She remains childless. Leah, on the other hand, she does not have that problem. She becomes pregnant and she gives birth to a son, and she names him Reuben. And she says, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. And by the way, the Hebrew name Reuben is kind of a play off that word for the Hebrew word for sea. And so she says, God has seen me. He's given me a son that I'm going to name C. And then she makes this really interesting statement. She says, surely my husband will love me now. I mean, he has to, right? Because, I know I'm not as pretty as Rachel, and I know he really wanted to marry Rachel. But I've given to him the thing that she can't give to him. I've given to him a son. He has to love me now. But it doesn't work. Jacob's affection is still for Rachel. And so what does she do? She tries again. Verse 33. She conceives again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too. And so she named him Simeon, which is based off the Hebrew word for hear. The Lord is hearing that my husband doesn't love me. And in the back of her mind, she's thinking, yeah, but now he's going to love me. Because come on, I've given him not one, but two sons. Doesn't work. Jacob's still in love with Rachel. She tries again, verse 34. Again she conceives, and when she gives birth to a son, she says, now at last. Third time's the charm, right? Now at last. My husband's going to become attached to me. Because I've borne him 3 sons. And so he was named Levi, which is based off the Hebrew word for attached. You know, as I read the story, I can't help but think that this is one of the saddest stories in the Bible. Because here's this girl, Leah, and what she's desperate for. She is desperate for love. And she's doing everything she can. She's trying everything she can think of to get that love. But no matter how hard she tries, she can't win her husband's heart. Here's what Leah is. She's the girl that nobody wants. You know, when you really stop to think about it, there's a little bit of Leah inside of each of us. You ever feel like you're somebody who is wanted by nobody? You ever have Leah's experience? Maybe for you, it happened when you were looking for a job because you lost your old one and you were trying to find a new one. And you sent out resume after resume, went to interview after interview, applied to job after job. But there was always somebody better than you. There was always somebody a little bit younger than you, or a little bit smarter than you, or a little bit faster at applying than you. And by the time you were through, you were just despondent because you felt like the employee that nobody wants. Or let me lean in and push hard. Maybe it goes like way back for you, back to when you were a kid. And maybe you had a parent or maybe both parents, and at least in your little heart and your little mind, it always felt like they were too busy for you. And you tried to get their attention, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in poor ways. But they always seem to be too busy for you. And you felt like the son or the daughter that nobody wanted. Come on, if we're real honest with ourselves, there's a little bit of Leah inside us all. And yet there is this universal human need. And here's the universal human need. It's very simple. It is to be loved, to be wanted. In fact, just so we're all kind of on the same page, and I'll go first here, okay? I'll raise my hand first. Who in here likes to be loved and be wanted? I think it's just like true of all of us. And so here's the question that I want to ask in the time that we have remaining in this message. How do we get love? Because love is something that we all need. Nobody wants to be left like Leah. So how do we get love? I want to give you 2 dead-end roads to getting love, because sometimes we try to get love in all sorts of strange ways and they never work. And then I want to give you one true way to get true love. And really there's only one way that actually works. And so we'll talk about that. But let's start with the 2 dead-end roads. And the first dead-end road is this. You can't get love by trying to earn love. You can't get love by trying to earn love. So go back to 1964. The Beatles came out with a hit. You know what it was called? You Can't Buy Me Love. That was a good piece of theology right there, because it's true. That's not something that you can do. Leah tries. She tries it by having sons. 1 son, 2 sons, 3 sons. It doesn't work because love doesn't work that way. You can't earn love like that. So several years ago, I had a friend of mine who fell head over heels for this girl that he had met who lived in a different state on a dating app, and the 2 of them started dating. And boy, he was madly in love with this girl, but shortly into kind of their virtual dating experience, strange things began to happen. She got really sick. She went into the hospital, and so she asked him to give her some money to cover hospital bills, and he did. And then she was in the hospital for so long that by the time she got out of the hospital, she had lost her job. And she asked him to give her more money to cover her while she didn't have a job, and he did. And then all of a sudden, her family members started getting sick, and they went into the hospital, and they needed money, and she asked him to give her some money, and so he did. And finally, after he had been in this relationship for a few months, he and I were talking about it. I didn't really know anything about it. And he said, I'm kind of frustrated because I keep offering to go see her because I want to be with her because we're so in love with each other. But something always comes up, and it's never a good time for me to go and see her. And I was the one who had to break it to him that he wasn't in a dating relationship. He was falling for a con. And he kind of knew it in the back of his mind. He did. But here's what he tricked himself into believing. He tricked himself into believing that he was only one Venmo payment away from true love. But he wasn't. Because love doesn't work that way. It's just a dead end. You can't get love by trying to earn love. Second dead end when it comes to trying to get love. You can't get love simply by loving yourself. You can't get love simply by loving yourself. So there's this old truism. Maybe you've heard it before. It's a truism, but I'll be honest, I'm not actually sure that it's really all that true. The truism goes something like this. If you want to be loved by anybody else, first you have to love who? Yourself. Now, this old truism is actually kind of the foundation for a lot of what we would call the modern day self-help movement. Because the self-help movement says that in order to help yourself, you first need to love yourself and support yourself and encourage yourself and affirm yourself. In fact, there are whole books full of self-affirmation statements, things that you can say to yourself to make you feel better about yourself. I looked a few up. How about this one? I love myself just as I am today. It's not a bad thing to say. Or how about this one? It is natural for me to love myself. Or here's the favorite one that I found, okay? I love this one. I accept my awesomeness. Now, you look at those, and they're not necessarily bad statements, but is it just me, or do those kind of strike you as a little hokey, maybe? There's actually a deeper problem with them, though. Sometimes, not only are they hokey, they're not even helpful. At least when you're truly struggling to love yourself. Because come on, you ever had a moment where you didn't love yourself? Where you didn't like yourself? Or here, let me push, let me shove. You ever had a moment in your life where you said these words, I hate myself? I hate myself because of something I've done, or I hate who I've become. It's at those moments in life that self-help doesn't actually really, help. Now, I want to make something clear. It's good to love yourself. In fact, it's better than good. It's biblical. Jesus talks about this. He says in Mark 12, verse 31, love your neighbor as what? Yourself. But here's what I want you to notice about Jesus' statement, okay? He wants you to love yourself, but he also wants you to love your neighbor. Because loving yourself isn't enough. You also need somebody else to love and somebody else who loves you. Because if the only person that you love is yourself, you're just going to be left by yourself. And you need more than that. Just loving yourself, if that's all you do, it's a dead-end road. You can't get love that way. So, how do you get love? Well, here's what Leah discovers in Genesis 29. You can get love when you simply receive love. You can get love when you simply receive love from somebody else. And what Leah discovers is that even when it feels like, seems like, and looks like there's nobody out there who loves her, there's someone who does. Here's when she discovers it. She actually discovers it when she gets pregnant again. Baby number 4. Genesis 29, verse 35, she conceives again, and she gives birth to a 4th son. And notice what she says this time, because her tune changes. She doesn't say, now finally my husband will love me, or now finally my husband will become attached to me. She says very simply, this time, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to praise the Lord. And then she gives her son a name. She names him Judah, which in Hebrew means praise. Here's what Leah discovered with her 4th son. She couldn't cajole or coerce love out of her husband. But she discovered that there was a God who wanted her even when nobody else did. Who loved her. Even when it felt like nobody else did. And because of that love, she breaks out in praise, because for Leah, here's what she discovered. God's love was enough. And here's the most important question I can ever ask you. If you feel like somebody that nobody wants, or if you feel like somebody that nobody loves, God does, is his love enough for you too? It's a fascinating thing about this son Judah, this 4th son, when Leah finally learns this lesson. Because Judah grows up to be quite a character. He grows up to have a couple of boys of his own, and those boys grow up to have boys, and they have boys and girls. And actually, Judah is actually the father, the patriarch of a pretty huge family. Leah's son is. In fact, this family begins to get so huge and so large that this family turns into not only a family, but like a whole tribe. It's one of the 12 tribes, some of you may know this, of the ancient nation of Israel. In fact, it's one of the most famous of the 12 tribes of the ancient nation of Israel. Now, one of the things that was really important in ancient Israelite culture was trying to trace all the family lineages and lines and family trees and genealogies. We do that at Zion here, right? Because everybody's related to everybody else. It was true in ancient Israel too. That's what they would do. And so they're always trying to figure out who was related to who. Well, about 2,000 years after this episode in Genesis 29 takes place, there's this New Testament author, and we don't know his name, but we know that he wrote a New Testament book, the book of Hebrews. And before the book of Hebrews was a book, it was probably a sermon. And so the preacher of Hebrews, he's doing some genealogical research in this sermon, because everybody loves a good genealogy and a good sermon, right? And so he's hopped on to Ancestry.com, and he's trying to look stuff up. And he discovers something that he mentions in Hebrews 7, verse 14. He says, I've done the research, and it is clear that our Lord, that be Jesus, descended from who? Judah. You see, here's the amazing thing. It looks like just a throwaway line, but it's a beautiful promise, because it turns out that from the girl nobody wanted came the Savior that the world desperately needed. It turns out that from the girl that nobody loved came the fullest, deepest, greatest, most profound expression of God's love. You see, the whole time, Leah was wanted by God. The whole time, Leah was loved by God. And what was true for Leah is true for you. Will you receive that? In fact, here's how I want to wrap up. I want to wrap up with actually my favorite verse of this story. I skipped over it earlier, so we're going to come back to it now. It actually gives us the reason that Leah was able to conceive any of these kids in the first place. This is Genesis 29, verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he blessed her. He enabled her to conceive. You know, even if you feel very loved, there may come a moment in your life where you feel a little less than loved. Where you feel like you're somebody who's not really needed or wanted by anybody. If that moment ever comes for you, make this verse your verse. Because when Leah wasn't loved, here's what God did. God saw. God saw. And God blessed Leah. Here's what he did. Through Leah, he sent Jesus. When you don't feel loved, here's what I want you to know. God sees. God knows. God cares. And through it all, he will bless you. Here's what he will do for you. To you, he will send Jesus. And the love that Jesus has, that's not just enough. That's more than enough.